So my name is Caleb, if we haven't spoken already. Today, I guess what I'm going to talk about is something compared to some of the content which we've been engaging with is maybe a very practical side of things. I've very recently completed a qualitative study where I've used a realist thematic analysis, and I feel like I've learned a lot from that process. I think there's things I would do the same, there's things I would do differently, and I thought today would be really helpful to sort of be honest with what I did, how I did it, and maybe get some feedback on how that process went, and discuss the implications of that potentially as well. So a little bit of brief background about the project empirically. So I am a trainee educational psychologist by trade, and so I'm looking at evaluating a school intervention. School intervention is called Philosophy for Children, and this is it's a structured dialogic pedagogy approach where essentially you get groups of students of any ages within a circle, and you use some form of stimulus, say a story or images, and then the students create their own questions around the stimulus, and then they engage in what we'd say a community of inquiry. So a group discussion with open-ended questions and open dialogue around that topic. There is lots of evidence to suggest already that it supports some cognitive development, such as higher order thinking, and also literacy, numeracy, creativity, and there is also some suggestions that it also can have a positive influence on their psychological well-being as well, although that aspect is a lot less developed in the critical thinking side of it. And although we have some ideas of what some of that might look like, it's not very coherent currently as to what aspects of the P4C programme leads to those wellbeing outcomes, in what circumstances, and how the certain implementation factors actually lead to potentially positive wellbeing for students. So this led to taking a realist qualitative approach, and so I had 4 teachers and a P4C trainer who also delivered sessions similar to a teacher in classrooms. I had a semi-structured focus group and 2 interviews as well, and the approach I very much took with this was call it almost like a direct extraction, where I was asking participants directly about their own retroductive accounts, their own understanding and theorisation of what is happening in the classroom as they're delivering the programme. And I used the 4C thematic analysis as the basis to the analysis process, and I added a final stage of a realist programme theory as well, to meet the aims of the study overall. I took this approach because it's an empirically underexplored area, so it was quite an exploratory piece of work just to explore what the potential wellbeing influences are. I think also the nature of wellbeing experiences, because they are so personalised, they're so subjective, you have to take a very sensitive approach to that to really unpick what wellbeing means for one student might mean differently for another, and so I think taking a realist approach really helps us to unpick the context as a core aspect of the approach rather than a tag-along interpretation at the end as such. Okay. Before I started collecting data, I thought very strongly about what psychological wellbeing experiences are, because in my view, in this piece of research, I was not an expert in the programme of Philosophy for Children. I'm still yet to see it in action. I've read about it. But what I brought as an expert was my understanding as a psychologist about children's psychological well-being. And when I was looking at trying to apply the ontological principles of critical realism to psychological well-being, I came up with two specific aspects of well-being. Where on the left side, we've got sensory experience. So when you're experiencing the world, young people are experiencing well-being through a different set of emotions, connectedness, engagement, etc. And on the right side are the the observable aspects of those experiences. So young person has that direct sensory experience of well-being, and then because I'm talking to practitioners, well, they're not having those experiences. What they're doing is they're inferring from the behaviour, from the relationships, from the environment that they can see what those well-being experiences are like. So I felt it was really important to begin with to sort of boundary in terms of the programme theory. What insight can my participants actually give? You can't give direct sensory experience, but we can give the inference from the observable aspects of that. And the specific dimensions were created from a literature review of the previous literature, and also then consultation logically with experts in the field in order to make sure that they were logically distinct aspects of well-being, and that they were grounded within the P4C literature, which then enabled me to narrow the analysis process. So this is the slide with the most information. This is the 4Cs analysis which I've used, and I personally found this approach it was a very structured approach, which I personally get a lot of comfort from a structured approach, personally. And so it started, the aim throughout this approach was to try to be as inductive as possible, try to be as grounded within the participants' actual responses as much as possible. And so the first stage very much involved an inductive coding phase, where I was looking through the transcripts, and what I was looking for was the discrete events that the participants were describing. And so they ended up with 86 separate events, which then led into clustering, which was at that stage I was looking at the codes, because 86 is quite a lot of codes, but when I started looking through and comparing between different participants, there were some events which were either the same or very, very similar. And so then I started to group those together into clusters, and there was 24 unique clusters, which is the left-hand table there, and there was also 10 additional implementation factors which didn't quite fit within as an event as such, but it was something that the participants felt were important and was made the outcomes contingent on that being present as well during the event of children participating. The third step, which I found, so the first two were very, very inductive. I've tried to minimise the level of interpretation as much as possible. The third step is when it started, where I was not making decisions based off my empirical understanding, it was more based off the logical side. And so I created a binary map where I took the 24 unique clusters and I compared each one individually with each other, and I made a decision as to whether there appeared to be a causal connection between those two clusters or whether there wasn't. So it's we'll potentially call it a crisp set or just a binary array, and that was the first step of my researcher-led interpretive decisions at that point. I also shared that with supervisors, and we scrutinised that together logically as a team. And then from that binary map, I produced, it's not on this screen, I produced some social network maps to help visualise and understand and interpret the data, because I think that binary map with 24 categories is quite a lot. It was hard cognitively, but then I made some visualisations. And then the themes in the fourth box constructing came directly from the binary map. So the process of translating these into a narrative of themes came very much concretely from the binary map, and I think there's strengths and weaknesses to that. I personally will talk about in a few minutes, but yeah, that's a concrete approach that I've tried to take. And then the final stage was the program theory. So on the left we have the themes from the previous slide, from the constructing phase, and on the right hand side we have the preliminary program theory. And so if you ever see on the themes 1, 2, 3, 4, on the program theory, they're still very closely related. So the idea is that it's trying to be as grounded as possible within those findings from the practitioner's own perspectives. And then I've cited here the Weger, because this is a paper where it's talking about lots of different configurations that you can make. And it's a paper which really opened my eyes to the possibilities of the different types of configurations you can use. And I think when I was conducting this aspect of it, I had to be flexible to the findings that the participants spoke about. Because I've taken a very inductive approach, I was in some ways limited by the responses that the practitioners gave. And so when they were talking, for example, about the context, although I preferred to have had the context within each configuration, the way they were talking about it, I think because they were teachers and they were thinking about things, individual students, but also at a classroom level and sometimes systemic level, it was really difficult during this analysis process, the way that we approached it, to be able to put them all coherently into the same ones. So instead of trying to fit a square peg into a triangular hole, I adapted the context of the implementation conditions because it felt from the data that I'd got that made the most sense as a researcher to make that decision. And then I think the main interpretive points that I've made is probably on the right hand side, which is where I've then used my expertise in psychological well-being to go, right, based on these different themes, based on these configurations, which aspects of well-being is being implicated here, whether that's explicitly or implicitly. And again, this right-hand column was very much it was a collaborative judgment that we made as a research team, where I shared the findings and we were thinking logically about what this actually means in relation to well-being. So some learning points that I got from conducting this process. I think little bits I've already touched on this, but the practitioners, first of all, they moved between different levels of configuration as such. So we were moving between, talked about individual student, and then we were talking about a classroom level, and that was quite difficult in the analysis to be able to unpick, because it was all sort of jumbled together. I think the idea of asking them directly individual questions for each area, I think that helped quite a lot. But it was still something that was difficult to remain inductive as well, rather than going straight into a deductive phase. That's a tension which was hard to balance, I think. I think the practitioner knowledge, they had limits in their own understanding, of course, because psychological well-being, it's very easy to take your experience and go, well, they're not experiencing well-being because I wouldn't feel well-being when they're doing those experiences. And also, of course, they don't have that direct sensory experience of that. So when I was making a program theory, it was really important to talk about the observable aspects of well-being rather than the experienced aspects as such. The binary map, I think, was really helpful because it's something concrete. So I can now share that with other researchers in peer review, etc. And you might disagree with some of the decisions that I've made there, but I think the fact that it's there and that I'm giving people the basis to disagree and to make their own interpretations, I think that's what the key thing is. I'm not going to sit here and say the analysis was perfect. It's my first time doing this sort of thing. And I'm open to someone saying that's wrong or that's different, that sort of thing. But because it's there, it's visible, it's transparent, that'll give us the basis to have those discussions. One of the configurations in particular was had underdeveloped empirical support, so it felt very pertinent by one participant, but it wasn't across different participants, and so I made a decision based on how it felt during the data collection and the analysis that this is still a key theme, and that was which theme was that? That was this bottom one here, where someone felt really strongly about how applying the skills and the link to autonomy. They made a very strong argument for it, but it was only about a single instance. But in terms of how we are then interpreting the findings, I think that's something which doesn't mean that it's weaker as such, but what it means is that future research needs to look at that more closely to be able to verify or reject that as a possibility. And I guess the bottom bit is probably need to be quite humble. It was 5 participants, and although they had brought brilliant experience, with excellent insight, I think it's really important with these sorts of smaller scale qualitative studies, although it's very in depth, is to always be open to that refinement. And so this project personally fits within a PhD project where I will be doing a realist review, as well as then speaking to children and young people about their experiences, and there'll be sort of forms of triangulation across there for a final programme theory, which will be more holistic and potentially more plausible as well between different groups. But that's it. Thank you for listening.